Use the card.
No, I won't finance another bad decision.
You're my wife. Start acting like it.
Mason, I heard every word.
You embarrassed me over one credit card?
You threw coffee at your wife.
Don't make this bigger than it is.
Thank you. You made everything clear.
$5 billion?
Why didn't you tell me?
You already decided who I was.
You lost me before you knew my worth.
Mason Cole did not lower his voice. He lifted the porcelain cup and threw its contents across his wife's chest in front of 40 witnesses. Coffee spread over Abigail Whitmore's ivory blouse. Dark, immediate, irreversible. The room went silent. She did not flinch. She did not reach for a napkin. She simply looked at her husband the way someone looks at a decision they have already made, and waited for the noise to stop. What Mason did not know was that the building they stood in belonged to her. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. It had not always looked like this. The marriage, at first, had looked like something else entirely. Abigail Whitmore and Mason Cole had met at a fundraising dinner 6 years earlier, the kind of evening where introductions were made with a handshake and a title. Mason had been polished, clear-spoken, the sort of man who knew which jokes landed in a room like that and which ones didn't. He'd listened when she spoke, which was not nothing. And he had presented himself as someone building something of his own, separate from inherited things, from old money, from the layered world Abigail had grown up inside. That separateness had appealed to her in ways she hadn't fully examined until much later. They lived now in a glass-walled apartment overlooking the Hudson. In the mornings it filled with pale gold light. In the evenings it became something sharper, all reflection and expense. Mason fit the room precisely. He was, by every visible measure, a successful man, senior partner, at a mid-sized financial firm, well-dressed, networked in ways that translated to dinner invitations and returned calls. He moved through rooms with ease. He knew which handshakes to hold a half-second longer. Abigail, standing beside him at those events, was described in the language people reach for when they don't know what else to say. Graceful, elegant, lucky. She wore neutral colors: ivory, charcoal, muted blue, nothing that demanded attention. When she spoke, her voice was low and measured, often lost beneath conversations Mason steered with practiced efficiency. He introduced her simply, "My wife, Abigail," never more, and people accepted that framing. Because it was convenient, because it fit. The truth existed somewhere far beyond it. Abigail's father, Edward Whitmore, had built his empire carefully and without announcement. He had no interest in headlines. His wealth lived in layered structures, trusts nested within holding companies, which held positions in energy, logistics, quiet technology infrastructure, and private lending. The kind of investments that shaped markets without appearing in them. When Edward died, the structure did not collapse. It shifted. Margaret Whitmore, his sister, became the stabilizing force. She was not sentimental. She did not allow grief to disrupt function. "The system holds," she told Abigail at their first formal meeting after the funeral, "because it was built to." Around them, attorneys from Carter and Lowell LLP moved through documents with practiced precision. Jonathan Carter himself sat across the table, measured, exact, and explained that this was not an inheritance so much as a continuation. "You are not receiving something new," he said. "You are stepping into something that has always included you." Abigail accepted this without ceremony. She spent the years that followed learning, not publicly, not visibly. She reviewed quarterly reports, sat through briefings where decisions were measured in decades, and learned the language of risk that required patience rather than performance. She learned when to act and, more importantly, when not to. By the time she met Mason, she had already stepped into full legal control of Whitmore Holdings. The structure was worth, at that point, just over $4 billion. She chose not to make it visible when they married, not out of deception, but out of experience. Disclosure changes the nature of every room it enters. She had not yet seen in Mason the understanding that could hold that truth without distorting it, so she kept the visible life small. A modest role described loosely as consulting, shared accounts that represented a fraction of a fraction. Mason reviewed those accounts with the confidence of a man who believed he understood the system. She let him believe it. Because belief, she had learned, shapes behavior more reliably than fact. At a dinner party, 2 months into their marriage, a man named Charles Voss, a senior infrastructure investor who had dealt with Whitmore Holdings for years, greeted Abigail before he registered Mason beside her. His posture shifted before he caught himself. He recovered quickly, extended a hand to Mason, and moved the conversation into safe territory. Abigail watched Mason notice nothing. She filed it quietly, the way she filed everything. That same evening, walking back to the car, her phone vibrated once. A brief encrypted message, subject line, WH Board, Q3 infrastructure approval pending. She read it, typed 2 words in response, and closed the screen before Mason turned to say something about the parking attendant. He didn't notice the phone. He never did. Later, in the apartment, while Mason loosened his tie and offered observations about the evening, Abigail removed her earrings and placed them in a small dish by the window. She listened. She said the things that closed conversations rather than opened them, and when the apartment went quiet, she sat alone near the glass and thought about the distance between what people saw and what was actually there. She was not yet sure what she was waiting for. But she understood, in the way she understood most, that patience was not the same as surrender, and that some truths revealed themselves more completely when given time. She opened her laptop, not to browse, to record. The first time Mason Cole asked to see a receipt, it had sounded almost reasonable. "Just for my records," he said, standing near the kitchen island with his phone in one hand, and the easy authority of a man who considered this a natural arrangement. Abigail handed it over without comment. At the time, it had seemed like preference rather than pattern. Structure, as he preferred to call it. A word that sounded neutral and reasonable and made ordinary control feel like responsible management. But structure, when repeated without examination, tends to evolve into something less neutral. The requests became more frequent over the months that followed. "Can you forward me that invoice? Just double-checking, what was this charge for?" We should tighten things a bit. Each statement, taken individually, was easy to dismiss. Taken together, they formed something else. Abigail noticed the pattern long before it would have been visible to anyone else. She noticed the way we became you, the way suggestions acquired expectation behind them, the way casual questions hardened into a kind of quiet oversight that expected compliance rather than conversation. She did not resist. She also did not comply entirely. What Mason received access to were the accounts that had always been visible, the shared household expenses, the modest joint holdings, the surface layer of a life that looked, from the outside, like any reasonably comfortable marriage in New York. He reviewed those figures with the confidence of a man who believed he understood the full picture. He was looking at a thumbnail of a landscape that stretched thousands of miles in every direction. What he never saw, Elise Grant's quarterly brief arriving on a Thursday in October, 14 portfolio positions, a new infrastructure commitment of $312 million, and one pending approval from Abigail on a partnership acquisition in the Pacific Northwest. Abigail read it over lunch, alone, at the kitchen table, while Mason was in a client meeting downtown. She approved the acquisition in 3 minutes and responded to 2 follow-up questions from Jonathan before Mason's name appeared in her phone for an unrelated reason, a reminder about a dinner reservation. She moved the conversation with Jonathan to a thread she kept separate, closed the brief, and was finishing her coffee when Mason arrived home that evening, talking about a client who had underperformed. She listened. She offered a question that helped him articulate what had gone wrong with the deal structure. He nodded, thanked her vaguely, and moved on. She said nothing about the Pacific Northwest. Not long after, there was a dinner with 2 of Mason's clients, Richard Hale and a quieter man named Gerald, who mostly watched other people speak. The conversation turned, as it often did in those rooms, to investment strategy. Richard held forth at length about emerging markets, volatility, diversification. His confidence exceeded his precision by a margin Abigail could measure from across the table. When Richard paused for effect, she offered a single observation. Long-term infrastructure tends to outperform short-term speculation in unstable regions. Richard considered this, nodded slowly. That's actually a fair point. Mason laughed before the sentence was finished. She reads its articles, he said. Keeps herself busy. The table moved on. Abigail did not re-enter the conversation. In the car afterward, Mason glanced at her from the driver's seat. You don't need to jump into those discussions. He said it without particular edge, the way one corrects a minor inefficiency. I wasn't jumping in, she replied. He exhaled. It just comes off like you're trying to prove something. She turned to the window. I wasn't. He closed the subject with 2 words. Let me handle those conversations. Handle. The word settled in the space between them and stayed there. That night she opened her laptop and typed, Dinner with Richard Hale and Gerald Walsh. Contribution redirected. Statement minimizing prior observation. Public context. 3 witnesses. She paused, added the quote as accurately as she could recall it. Then saved the file in the folder she kept behind 3 layers of password protection, not because she was afraid Mason would find it, but because precision required structure, and structure required protection. The folder already contained 43 entries. They weren't collected obsessively. They were collected the way someone who understands evidence collects it, steadily, without drama, because facts matter more without embellishment, and dates matter more than impressions. Jonathan had told her years ago, in a different context entirely, that documentation is not proof of intent. It is proof of pattern. Pattern, in legal terms, is often more persuasive than any single event. She hadn't been thinking about legal terms when she started the folder. She had simply been thinking clearly. Mason, in the weeks that followed, began suggesting what he called consolidation of their accounts. Less fragmentation, he said. More efficient oversight. He presented this in the language of practicality rather than control, which was, Abigail had come to understand, how most control presented itself. She listened. She agreed to discuss it. She moved one account, the smallest, most visible, least consequential structure attached to her name, into a configuration that gave him the sense of expanded access. He accepted this without examining it closely. That same week, Jonathan called with a regulatory update affecting one of the Whitmore holding entities. A structure used for European private lending had encountered a new reporting requirement under a cross-border compliance update. It needed to be adjusted before the quarter close. They talked for 11 minutes. Abigail approved the adjustment, asked 2 questions about timeline, and thanked him. She made the call from the back bedroom with the door closed. When she came out, Mason was in the kitchen reading something on his laptop. He didn't ask who she'd been on the phone with. She didn't tell him. That night, after he'd gone to sleep, she sat by the window and thought about what she was doing. Not the records. Not the financial structure. The marriage itself. The question of when a series of small accommodations becomes a life built around someone else's comfort at the cost of your own. She had space for Mason because she had believed, in the early years, that the space would be filled differently than it was. She was no longer certain of that. But she was not, by nature, someone who made decisions quickly. Patience, she had learned, was not the same as avoidance. She was still watching, still measuring, still waiting to see whether what she was observing was a phase or a conclusion. She opened her laptop again, made another entry. Then she opened a separate folder, the one labeled Carter and Lowell, and reviewed, for the 3rd time in a month, a document Jonathan had prepared at her request 2 years earlier. A contingency plan. Quiet. Complete. Everything that would need to happen in order if she ever decided it was time. She had not yet decided, but she had read it 3 times. That was something. Mason came home early on a Thursday evening in November, with the careful composure of someone who has rehearsed a conversation on the way. Abigail was at the kitchen table reviewing a summary Elise had sent that afternoon. She closed the laptop as she heard his key in the lock, not abruptly, but with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to transitioning between layers of her life. Mason set his briefcase down, loosened his cufflinks, said we should talk, with the tone of a man who had already decided what the talk would conclude. There's an opportunity, he said, pouring himself a drink without asking if she wanted one. Short window. High return. She waited. The deal had been building for weeks, he continued. A private equity position that needed to move fast. The projected returns were significant. Significant meaning the number he named made the kind of sense on paper that required certain assumptions to remain true simultaneously, which they had not, in fact, remained. He had already committed to the pitch. He had already implied, to the investors he was working with, that the capital would be available. I need access to additional funds, he said, just temporarily. From where? She asked. He looked at her as if the answer were self-evident. From us. The word settled between them. Abigail held his gaze. Which account? The joint one isn't sufficient, he said. I'll need you to use your card. Her expression did not change. My card? Yeah. To bridge the gap. It'll be covered within weeks. Abigail understood what he was asking. She understood it at several levels simultaneously. The immediate financial request, what it represented in the context of his deal, and what it meant within the longer pattern she had been documenting for over a year. She considered her response carefully. Not because she was uncertain, but because precision mattered, and precision in moments like this was a form of control she had always maintained. I won't be able to do that, she said. The sentence was quiet, without apology. Mason blinked. What do you mean? I won't be able to use my card for that. He set his glass down with a sound that was slightly sharper than the surface warranted. It's temporary, he said. You're not losing anything. That's not the issue. Then what is? She paused, not searching, but choosing. It's not something I'm comfortable doing. The word landed wrong for him. Comfort wasn't the variable he was operating within. Control was, and comfort as a reason felt, to Mason, like an argument that didn't respect the stakes he was working with. Abigail, he said, lowering his voice in the way he did, when he wanted to signal that the time for preferences had passed. This isn't about comfort. It's about practicality. I handle our finances. I understand what's needed here. The emphasis on understand was deliberate. She heard it. I'm aware, she said. Then you know this makes sense. I know what you're asking. And you're refusing. The word sharpened in his mouth. I'm declining, she corrected. Her tone did not change. The distinction mattered. To her, at least. Mason heard it as a correction, which it was, and that made things worse. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Our apartment, usually generous in its quiet, felt narrower than usual. Mason exhaled, attempted to reset. Is this about trust? He asked. Because if it is, that's a different conversation. It's not about trust. Then explain it to me. She looked at him, not with resistance, but with something that was harder to argue against. I don't need to justify every decision I make in order for it to be valid. The words were not confrontational, they were simply true, and that, more than the refusal itself, seemed to be what since unsettled Mason, because he was accustomed to positions having pressure points. Reasons that could be reframed, angles that could be shifted. A boundary that explained itself only as itself had no edge to push against. He stepped back. When did this become a negotiation? It isn't, she said. Then why does it feel like one? She did not answer immediately. Because the answer would not change what he was already feeling. It feels different, she said finally, because this is the first time I've said no. The statement arrived with more weight than its volume suggested. Mason let out a short, incredulous sound. So that's what this is. You're making a point. No, I'm making a decision. He shook his head. Paced once across the room. You're overcomplicating something simple, he said. This is how partnerships work. You support each other. I agree, she said, then act like it. The edge in his voice was harder now. She did not flinch. I do support you in ways that matter. This matters, he insisted. It matters to you, she said. The distinction again. He stopped pacing. This is not the time for philosophy. I need a solution. She met his gaze. This is mine. There was no escalation in her tone, no raised voice, no visible emotion, only resolution. And that, more than anything, removed the variables Mason knew how to work with. None to and argue against, nothing to persuade, a boundary that simply stood. He finished his drink. Fine, he said. We'll revisit this. Abigail inclined her head slightly, if you'd like. But they both understood, even if only one of them could name it, that this was not something that would be revisited. This was something that had already changed. Mason retreated to his study. The sound of his door closing was quiet but deliberate. Abigail remained at the kitchen table for a moment. She did not go after him. She did not soften the edges of what had just happened. She sat still in the way she sat still through most things and let the moment settle into what it was. Then she opened her laptop. Request for credit card access declined. Escalation in tone. No agreement reached. She typed one more line, paused, added it. First explicit refusal. She saved the document, closed the screen. Sat in the quiet of the apartment as the city moved below. Not tense, not uncertain, but aware, because some moments do not announce themselves as turning points. They simply arrive, defined not by noise but by the permanent quality of what has shifted. Her phone lit up with a calendar reminder. Tomorrow morning, Langford Club, 8:30 a.m. Business breakfast. Mason had noted it weeks ago. He hadn't mentioned it again. But his assistant Sophia Lynn had confirmed the reservation by text that afternoon, adding in a slightly hesitant postscript. I wasn't sure if you'd be attending, Mrs. Cole. Would you like me to add a place setting for you as well? Abigail typed back, yes, thank you, Sophia. She set the feuilletes down on the table. Looked out at the lights below. Tomorrow, then. The Langford Club had been standing on East 64th Street since 1887, and in that time it had learned to be a particular kind of room. Quiet, not silent. Refined, not cold. The kind of place where conversations were conducted at half volume and agreements were made over breakfasts no one described as working. The lighting was low and consistent. The tablecloths were white. Every surface had been selected to communicate permanence. Abigail arrived at 8:20. The club's director, a man named Thomas Edgeworth, who had managed the property for 11 years, met her in the entrance hall. Ms. Whitmore. He said her name the way people say names they have learned to treat carefully. Always a pleasure to have you. Thank you, Thomas. She returned the greeting with the ease of someone who belonged in the room and had never needed to announce it. Mason arrived 7 minutes later with the energy of a man who had been preparing for something. He was followed by Richard Hale. The investor Abigail had sat across from at dinner months ago, and a second man Abigail had seen at 2 prior events, but whose name she had not been given. They were deep in preliminary conversation when Mason registered Abigail, standing near the far end of the table, and nodded at her with the brief, clipped acknowledgement of someone directing traffic. You're early, he said, as if this required an explanation. I am, she agreed. Richard Hale offered a warmer greeting. Miss Cole, good to see you. Abigail, she said, good to see you as well. They sat. Thomas and his staff moved efficiently without intruding. Coffee arrived, a small arrangement of pastries. The room was nearly full. 2 other tables occupied. A total of perhaps 40 people distributed across the space, their conversations low and contained. Mason began the business of the breakfast within minutes. He spoke well, as he always did in rooms like this. He laid out the investment structure, the projected timelines, the anticipated returns. Richard listened with the practiced neutrality of someone who had heard many pitches and was deciding what category this one belonged in. The other investor, Abigail, learned his name was Daniel Pryor, made notes without revealing what they meant. Then Mason said it. He said it naturally, in the flow of his presentation, as if it were simply one element among several. We're prepared to bring in significant personal capital to anchor the position. Between my firm's exposure and what we're pulling from the assets, the coverage is solid. Abigail did not react visibly. She had heard versions of this before. The casual implication, the framing of her resources as shared resources, the way he described family as a unit of which he was the managing voice. She had documented those moments. She had been patient with them. But this was different. This was in front of investors. This was a pitch. This was Mason using the shape of her wealth as a selling point, without knowing what he was actually describing. Richard Hale glanced at her briefly. She held his gaze without expression. Mason continued. He was building toward the ask, a co-investment commitment, a handshake before a formal document. He reached the part where personal capital was the point, and looked at Abigail in the way he sometimes looked at her in these rooms, not as a participant, but as a prop that should remain still and affirming. Abigail, he said, as if inviting her to nod. She set down her coffee cup. I won't be supporting this investment, she said. Her voice was quiet and clear and carried exactly as far as she intended. The sentence did not shout. It did not need to. It simply occupied the space and would not be moved. Mason's expression shifted. Not dramatically, he was too practiced for that, but in the specific way of a man whose script has just gone in a direction he did not write. He laughed once, a sound without warmth, and said quietly, "That's not the time or place." "I know," she said, "but you made it the time and place." His jaw tightened. "You're embarrassing me." The table was quiet. Richard Hale had put down his pen. Daniel Pryor had stopped writing. Abigail did not look away from Mason. She was not performing composure. She simply had it. Mason's hand moved. He reached for his coffee cup. His grip was too tight. And then, in the way that things happen that cannot be taken back, he threw it. Not explosively, not with the theatrical violence of rage, but with the short, sharp motion of someone who has stopped weighing consequences. The coffee hit Abigail across the front of her blouse. Hot, dark, immediate. It spread the way spilled things always do, faster than expected, wider than intended. The room went still. 40 people. No one spoke. Abigail looked down once, then looked back at Mason. She did not reach for the cloth napkin on the table beside her. She did not make a sound. She held his gaze for a moment that was long enough to mean something, and then she said, very quietly, "Thank you for making this clear." She picked up her bag. She pushed her chair back with the same steadiness she brought to everything. She stood, and she walked toward the exit with the kind of pace that doesn't rush because it has nowhere to hurry to. Heads turned. No one said anything. Near the entrance, Sophia Lynn stood holding a folder she had been about to deliver. Her face had gone completely still. In the entrance hall, Thomas Edgeworth met Abigail before she reached the door. He had a clean linen towel in his hands and something in his expression that went beyond the professional. He held the towel toward her and said, quietly, "I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore." "Don't be," she said. She accepted the towel and pressed it briefly to the front of her blouse. "It's exactly what I needed." Thomas held the door for her. The morning light outside was clear and cold. In the car, Abigail sat still for a moment before reaching for her phone. She scrolled to a contact she kept under a name that only she and 2 other people would recognize. She pressed call. It rang twice. "Jonathan," she said when he answered. She heard the quiet of his office on the other end, the slight shift of a chair. "It's time," she said. "Open everything." A pause. Just long enough to mean he understood exactly what she meant. "Understood," Jonathan said. "I'll need 48 hours. "You have them," Abigail said. She ended the call, looked out through the windshield at the street. Someone was walking a dog past the club's entrance. A taxi was pulling away. The city was doing what it always did, moving forward indifferent and constant, entirely unaware that something had just ended. She folded the linen towel neatly in her lap. It still smelled of coffee. She set it on the seat beside her. Jonathan Carter had been practicing law for 26 years, and he had a gift that most people in his position did not advertise. He knew when a client was calling to talk, and he knew when they were calling to move. Abigail had never called simply to talk. Within 4 hours of her call from outside the Langford, 2 things had been set in motion. The first was the formal restructuring of Abigail's public-facing role within Whitmore Holdings, a process that existed in outline form in a contingency document Jonathan had prepared 2 years prior at her request, and which required only her authorization to activate. The second was the retention of a separate litigation counsel, a woman named Diana Voss, who specialized in high-asset dissolution proceedings, and who had a reputation for being very calm and very thorough. Abigail met with Diana that afternoon in a conference room with a view of Midtown. Diana had a yellow legal pad and a way of asking questions that felt more like listening than interrogating. She reviewed the documentation Abigail had been keeping, 47 entries in the folder, organized by date, quote, and context, and said, without inflection, that this was useful. Useful, Abigail noted, was Diana's version of impressive. Mason, meanwhile, returned to his office from the Langford and spent the remainder of the morning attempting to manage the aftermath of a breakfast that had not ended the way he had planned. Richard Hale had not called. Daniel Pryor had not responded to his follow-up message. The morning felt like a door that had closed before he'd finished walking through it. That afternoon, he called Abigail. She answered on the third ring. "I lost my temper," he said. He said it in the way people lead, with an acknowledgement when what they want is what comes after it. "You provoked it," he added, "by declining to participate in front of investors." She let him finish. "I'm not interested in revisiting this morning," she said. "I'll have my attorney contact yours. A beat." "Your attorney?" The phrase sounded wrong in his mouth, like a word in a language he hadn't expected to encounter. "Yes. Since when do you have an attorney?" "Since before you asked," she said, which was true in ways he did not yet understand. She ended the call. Jonathan reached out to Mason's lawyer, a man named Craig Dutton who worked primarily in asset management and had handled Mason's corporate agreements for 3 years, with a brief, professional note stating that Abigail Whitmore would be seeking dissolution of the marriage and requesting that both parties refrain from financial transfers pending full disclosure of assets. The note was short. It was the length of something that does not need elaboration because the elaboration will come later. Craig called Mason immediately. Mason sat in his office chair with the phone pressed to his ear and listened to his lawyer, read the note twice. He said, for the second time that day, that this was a misunderstanding. Craig Dutton did not say anything for a moment. Then he said that in his experience, notes like this were rarely misunderstandings. That evening, Mason told his partner at the firm, Gerald Walsh, who had been at the firm longer than Mason, and whose opinion Mason had always found inconvenient, that there was a personal situation that was being managed. Gerald nodded once, in the way of someone who has heard that sentence before and knows what it tends to precede. Later, when Mason returned to the apartment, Abigail was not there. She had arranged to stay, for the time being, with Margaret. It was not a dramatic departure. She had packed a single bag, quietly and efficiently, while Mason had still been at the office. She left the apartment the way she'd entered most rooms in the past 6 years, without announcing herself. Just a note on the kitchen counter that said, "I'll be in touch through Jonathan." Mason stood in the kitchen for a long time with the note in his hand. Across town, in Margaret Whitmore's apartment, spare, precise, nothing decorative that didn't also serve a function. Abigail sat in a chair by the window with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking and let herself be still. Margaret sat across from her. Margaret Whitmore did not say "I told you so." She had never operated that way. She asked, instead, "What do you need?" It was the right question. It was always the right question. Abigail set down the tea. "I need the full structure on record. Public, with my name on it." Margaret considered this. She was 63 and had navigated more complicated situations than this one, and the expression she wore when she was thinking was impossible to distinguish from her resting face. "Jonathan has what he needs?" she asked. "Everything," Abigail said. Margaret nodded. "How long?" "Diana says 3 to 4 weeks for initial disclosure. Jonathan will move faster on the registration. Then we wait 3 to 4 weeks, Margaret said. Abigail nodded. There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. Outside, the city continued its indifferent motion. "Are you all right?" Margaret asked, which was itself an answer, in a way. "I'm clear," she said finally. "I've been waiting to feel clear for longer than I realized." Margaret reached over and picked up Abigail's teacup. "You're not drinking this," she said, and took it to the kitchen. That night, Abigail reviewed a document Jonathan had sent to her secure email. The initial filing papers for Whitmore Holdings' public registration update, which would list her as principal beneficial owner for the first time in the entity's modern form. There would be a 48-page financial disclosure attached: every trust, every holding, every investment position, current valuation. At the bottom of page 3, Whitmore Holdings, LLC, total estimated net value current quarter, $5. $2 billion. She signed the cover page digitally. Sent it back. Then she turned off her laptop, set it on the bedside table, and lay in the dark of the guest room with the particular kind of quiet that belongs to decisions that have finally been made. She slept well. Mason's lawyer called at 10:45 on a Tuesday morning, and the first thing Craig Dutton said was, "I need you to come in, today. Not later this week. Not at your convenience, today." Mason arrived at Craig's office at noon. It was a quiet firm on Park Avenue, 3 partners, understated furniture, the kind of place that communicated competence without requiring it to be said. Craig was waiting for him in the conference room. On the table was a printed document, 47 pages, paper clipped at the corner. Craig placed his hand on the cover page and pushed it toward Mason without speaking. Mason looked at the document. Carter and Lowell LLP letterhead. Subject: Whitmore Holdings Disclosure Summary Q4 Current Year. Requested by Diana Voss, Counsel for Abigail Elise Whitmore. He opened it. Page 1 was an index. Page 2 was a legal certification. Page 3 was where the structure began, a diagram of entities, trusts, holding companies, and subsidiary organizations branching downward from a single point of origin at the top. At the top, 3 words, Whitmore Holdings, LLC. Directly below it, in a clean box, Principal Beneficial Owner, Abigail Elise Whitmore. Mason read it twice. Then he said, "Explain this to me." Craig sat down. He was deliberate in the way people are deliberate when they understand that what they are about to say cannot be unsaid. "What you're looking at," he said, "is a disclosure of your wife's personal holdings. These are assets that predate your marriage by approximately 20 years. They are held exclusively in her name through layered legal structures. There is no marital commingling. She maintained a complete separation between these holdings and any joint financial arrangements during your marriage." Mason turned to page 4, Energy Investments, Infrastructure, Private Lending Positions, Real Estate Holdings including, he noted, a significant commercial property portfolio. He stopped. "Craig," he said. He pointed to a line on page 11, the name of a property group. The address listed was his firm's office building. Craig looked at it, nodded once. "That appears to be correct." "She owns the building my firm operates from," Mason said. "According to this disclosure," Craig said carefully, "a holding entity connected to Whitmore Holdings holds a controlling stake in the property group that owns that building." "Yes." Mason set the document down. He looked at the table. He looked at Craig. He said, again, "That can't be right." "It has been confirmed," Craig said. 3 independent valuators. The total estimated value of all Whitmore Holdings entities as of the current quarter is listed on page 3, bottom of the page. Mason flipped back. "Read the number." "Read it again." $5.2 billion, Craig said, in case the number wasn't registering. It was registering. It was registering in the way that rewrites everything you thought you understood about a room you have lived in for years. Mason sat very still. He thought, involuntarily, about a dinner party where he had said, "You don't need to jump into those discussions." About a car ride where he had said, "Let me handle those conversations." About a client breakfast where he'd explained a market principle that Abigail had already understood in a way he hadn't. About every time he had introduced her as "my wife, Abigail," as if that were sufficient, as if that were complete. About a restaurant in Midtown where Charles Vossas had greeted her before registering Mason was there. About Thomas Edgeworth. At the Langford, saying, "Ms. Whitmore, always a pleasure to have you." He had heard it. He had filed it as nothing. "Is there any basis to contest the structure?" Mason asked. He said it in the voice of a man who needs a specific kind of answer. Craig was quiet for a moment. "On what grounds?" "She didn't disclose this before we married." "She had no legal obligation to," Craig said. "There was no prenuptial agreement, and the assets predate your marriage by 2 decades. Separate property law in New York is clear on this. What was shared between you, the joint accounts, the shared apartment, the mutual holdings, that's what's subject to division. The Whitmore structure is not." Mason stared at the document. "She could have told me," he said. "It wasn't entirely a legal argument. It was something else." Craig did not have an answer for that. He was a lawyer, not a marriage counselor, and he understood the difference. "What's our position?" Mason asked. Craig placed his hands on the table. "We review the joint marital assets, establish their value, and proceed to mediation or settlement. What Abigail's team has indicated is that they're open to a fair division of the shared property." Diana Voss's communication was professional and non-adversarial. Mason laughed once, without humor. "Non-adversarial. In legal terms," Craig said, "it's accurate." Mason stood. Paced once across the room the way he had paced in the kitchen the night he first said, "Fine, we'll revisit this." as if motion could change the shape of the room. "Why didn't she tell me?" he said again, not asking Craig, just asking. Craig watched him, then said, carefully, "I can't answer that." Mason sat back down. He looked at the document again. He turned to the real estate section and found, on page 22, a list of commercial properties. The building where he had worked for 9 years was in the third column. He stared at the address. He had walked into that lobby 7,000 mornings. He had told Abigail, from that office, that she didn't need to worry about the finances. He had told her, in the room she owned the building that housed, that he handled things. The particular quality of that irony was not lost on him. It just arrived too late. Craig was speaking again. Something about the timeline for disclosure exchange, but Mason was only partially present for it. The rest of him was somewhere further back, moving through 6 years of evenings and events and corrections and assumptions, looking for the thing he should have seen. He found, instead, only evidence of everything he hadn't looked for. That evening, his phone showed a missed call from Daniel Brooks. No voicemail. He called back. No answer. He tried twice more that week. Daniel never returned the calls. The world, it seemed, had already begun to adjust to new information that Mason was still processing. Gerald Walsh knocked on Mason's office door on a Thursday morning and closed it behind him. He didn't sit down. Gerald rarely sat when he had something difficult to say. He preferred the standing position of a man who hadn't fully committed to the conversation. "The firm's compliance officer has requested a meeting," Gerald said. Mason leaned back in his chair. "The audit? It goes a bit beyond audit," Gerald said. He folded his hands in front of him. "There's been a formal complaint filed with the firm's external oversight body." From a party who was present at the Langford breakfast. Mason was quiet. "The complaint," Gerald continued, "pertains to representations you made during that meeting. Specifically, the implication that personal assets, your wife's assets, were available to collateralize a client investment. If those assets were, in fact, not jointly held and not available for that purpose, then characterizing them as family capital in an investment pitch constitutes a potential misrepresentation to clients." Mason opened his mouth. Gerald held up a hand. "I'm not here to adjudicate it," he said. "I'm here because the firm's position requires a response, and because you should know what's coming." Mason said that the breakfast had been informal, that the language had been conversational, that no contract had been signed. Gerald nodded, slowly and without much conviction. He said he understood that was one reading of it. He also said that the firm had an obligation to investigate the complaint, and that investigation meant Sophia Lynn would be asked to provide a formal statement about what she had observed. Mason went still. "Sophia was in the room," Gerald said. "She delivered a file during the breakfast. She witnessed the full exchange." "Including," Mason said, and didn't finish the sentence. "Including what happened with the coffee," Gerald said, evenly. "Yes." Mason looked at his desk, at the document binder he'd been reviewing when Gerald knocked. He thought about Sophia Lynn, her careful competence, her habit of never remarking on what she observed, the expression on her face as he'd walked past her on the way out of the Langford. He had not looked directly at her. He had been looking ahead. He should have noticed her face. "She'll give an accurate account," he said. "That wasn't a question." Gerald said, "I would expect so." Yes. There was a silence. In the hallway outside, 2 associates walked past talking about a filing deadline. The ordinary sound of a firm continuing to function while one corner of it was quietly deteriorating. "I'll speak with the compliance officer," Mason said. "We'll speak with her together," Gerald corrected. "Tomorrow, 10 o'clock. His tone was not unkind, but it had the quality of a sentence that had already been decided. He left without further discussion. Mason called Abigail that afternoon. He called from his private line, not through Craig Dutton, which was not what Diana Voss had asked him to do. The call went to voicemail after 4 rings. He listened to her voice on the message, brief, professional, "Give me a moment, and I'll call you back," and felt the specific strangeness of having heard that voice every day for 6 years, and now being directed to her attorney. He left a message. He said, "I need you to understand what's happening here. This isn't just about us. I could lose everything." He said it without thinking about how the statement sounded, what it revealed about what he had been unable to see. He could lose everything, as if what she had already lost, the dignity of a public humiliation, the years of documentation and measured patience, the careful quiet of a person who had been decided about before she could speak, did not constitute anything that could be lost. Abigail listened to the voicemail once. It was Diana Voss's office that called her back, not her own number. Diana said, simply, that there had been contact outside the agreed channel, and asked whether Abigail wanted to respond. Abigail said no. Diana said she would note it and move on. Abigail did not call Mason back. Sophia Lynn arrived at the firm's HR office the following morning with a handwritten statement she had prepared the night before. She had not discussed it with Mason. She had not told him she was coming. She described what she had witnessed at the Langford Club in the order in which it had occurred: the breakfast setting, the attendees, the conversation, the moment when Mason threw the coffee, the way Abigail had responded, the way Abigail had walked out. She described it factually, without embellishment, because that was what she had actually seen. She answered 3 follow-up questions clearly, and did not volunteer more than was asked. She left the office and went back to her desk, and spent the rest of the morning drafting correspondence for a client filing, because her work still needed doing regardless of what was happening in other rooms. That evening, Abigail was at Margaret's apartment reviewing the updated Whitmore Holdings registration when Elise Grant sent a brief. Portfolio unchanged. 1 commitment closing next week. Q4 projection stable. All standard. All continuing as it always had, with the indifferent reliability of a structure designed to outlast disruption. Margaret came to the doorway with 2 cups of tea and said, without preamble, "Daniel Brooks has withdrawn his firm's affiliation from Mason's practice group." Abigail looked up. Margaret set the tea down. "I heard from Thomas Edgeworth. Apparently Daniel was at the Langford that morning." At another table, Abigail was quiet for a moment. "Did you know?" Margaret sat. "I knew Thomas knew him. I didn't arrange anything." Abigail nodded. They drank their tea in the comfortable silence of 2 people who understood each other, without needing to narrate it. Later, Jonathan called with an update on the settlement timeline. Diana had been in contact with Craig Dutton's office, and both parties were ready to arrange a formal meeting. The terms would be simple, Jonathan said. Simple because the actual picture was now clear. What was shared, the joint property, the apartment lease, 2 small accounts, 1 vehicle, a combined value of approximately $4 million. That was the entirety of the marital estate. He told her Mason's lawyer had proposed a different figure, based on a misunderstanding of what the marital estate included. Jonathan said this with a very quiet laugh, which, from him, was unusual. Abigail said, "When?" Jonathan said, 2 weeks, his office. "I'll make sure the document is in front of them when they sit down." "Good," Abigail said. She hung up, looked at the Whitmore Holdings registration on the screen. At her name at the top, principal beneficial owner. It had always been there in the architecture of the thing. Now it would simply be visible. She thought briefly about the coffee cup, about the moment before and the moment after, about the way silence had served her for so long and had, eventually, served its purpose and ended. She closed the laptop, said goodnight to Margaret, went to bed. 2 weeks, she thought, then it would be over. Jonathan Carter's conference room occupied the north corner of the 31st floor, with a view that took in the upper end of Central Park, and, on clear days, the thin line of the Hudson beyond it. The room was set up for exactly this kind of meeting, a long, rectangular table, 4 chairs on each side, water in glass pitchers, a legal pad and pen at every seat. Clean, neutral, efficient. The kind of room that had been designed to move people from one state to another. Abigail arrived 15 minutes early. She sat on the far side of the table, her hands folded in front of her, and did not look at the view. Jonathan sat beside her. Diana Voss, on her other side, reviewed something on a tablet with the quiet focus of a woman who was always ready before anyone else needed her to be. Mason arrived at the appointed time with Craig Dutton. Mason had dressed carefully, suit, pressed, every element in order, which was the only kind of composure available to him, now that other kinds had become harder to maintain. He sat across from Abigail and looked at her for the first time since the Langford. She met his gaze without difficulty. Without anger, either. She simply looked at him the way you look at something that you have already understood and are now simply confirming. Jonathan began. He walked Mason's attorney through the structure of the disclosure they had already received, not as a reveal, since Craig had seen it, but as a formal accounting in the context of the settlement. He named each entity. He described the trust architecture. He referenced the independent valuations. He explained, for the record, that the total value of Whitmore Holdings and its subsidiary structures was $5. $2 billion as of the current quarter, and that these assets predated the marriage by 19 years and bore no marital commingling as defined under New York separate property law. Craig nodded throughout. He had reviewed the document 8 times. He knew exactly what it said. Mason sat with the 47-page disclosure open in front of him, even though he had read it as well. He turned to page 3 again, as if the number might be different this time. It was not. Diana Voss outlined the terms of the proposed settlement. The joint marital estate, the apartment lease with approximately 9 months remaining, 2 shared investment accounts, 1 vehicle, had a combined value of approximately $1. $4 million. Standard division under New York domestic relations law, absent specific agreement, would split this equitably. Diana proposed a 50-50 division, with each party retaining personal property acquired individually during the marriage. The Whitmore Holdings structure would not be touched, could not be touched, was not legally available to be touched. Craig looked at the number. He made a note on his legal pad. Then he said what he needed to say. What about the claims my client has raised regarding non-disclosure of assets prior to marriage? Diana addressed this without raising her voice. She outlined the law. She noted that no prenuptial agreement had been requested or offered by either party. She noted that financial disclosure prior to marriage was a voluntary rather than obligatory act, and that separate property, assets predating the marriage and held entirely outside joint structures, carried no disclosure requirement. She said this clearly, completely, and with the precision of someone who had reviewed every relevant precedent. Craig had no counter to this. He had known he wouldn't. He conferred with Mason in a low voice. Mason nodded once. He looked at the table. Then he looked up. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" Jonathan held his pen still. Mason said it directly to Abigail, not through the lawyers. Just to her, across the table that separated them, with a directness he had not often managed toward her when it might have mattered. Abigail considered the question. She had thought about how she might answer it if it came. "Because you had already decided what I was," she said. "Telling you would have changed the transaction, not the relationship." Mason did not immediately respond. He sat with that for a moment. She was not cruel in saying it. She was not performing composure for the room. She was simply being accurate, in the same way she had always been accurate, which was the only way she knew how to be. Craig conferred with Mason again. Then he offered a modified counter-proposal on the marital assets. A slightly different split based on a claim Mason had made regarding the apartment renovation costs. Jonathan reviewed it, conferred briefly with Diana, and they agreed to a minor adjustment. The numbers were finalized. The terms were documented. Craig prepared the signature pages. Mason looked at the settlement agreement for a long moment. He looked at the line where his name would go. He looked at the column of figures next to it. The dollar, $4 million divided minus adjustment. "This is it?" he said. Jonathan said, "That is the entirety of what was shared." Mason picked up the pen. He turned it in his hand once. Then he signed. Craig collected the documents. Diana made her copies. Jonathan reviewed the execution pages and confirmed they were complete. The meeting had lasted 53 minutes. Mason stood. Craig moved toward the door, and then Mason stopped. He turned back to the table. He was looking at Abigail, but not the way he had looked at her across 6 years of dinners and events and apartments and assumptions. He was looking at her the way someone looks when they are seeing something they should have seen far earlier and have only just managed to focus their eyes. "The Langford Club," he said. He said it quietly, in the way of someone arriving at a conclusion rather than making an accusation. It's yours, isn't it? It wasn't a question. He had put together the pieces, Thomas Edgeworth's deference, the property portfolio on page 22, the ease with which she had walked out of a room as if she belonged to it more than anyone else present. He had assembled it into a question that was already an answer. Abigail looked at him. She did not confirm. She did not deny. Jonathan said nothing. Mason nodded, very slowly, as if receiving the last piece of something he had started to understand too late. He put his coat on. He walked to the door. He did not look back again. Craig Dutton followed him out. The elevator dinged softly in the hallway. Then the conference room was quiet. Jonathan set his pen down. Diana closed her tablet. Abigail looked at the view, the park below, the pale autumn sky, the city moving forward with its usual indifference to the specific weight of any given moment. She felt something she hadn't expected to feel in this room. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but a particular clarity. The kind that comes not from winning, but from no longer needing anything from someone who couldn't give it. She picked up her bag. Jonathan said, "I'll have the final documents to you by end of week." She thanked him. She thanked Diana. She shook both their hands with the warmth of someone who meant it. Then she walked out of the conference room, took the elevator down to the street, and stepped into the afternoon like a woman who knew exactly where she was going. 3 weeks after the settlement documents were signed, Mason Cole was placed on indefinite administrative leave from his firm. The compliance review had concluded. Sophia Lynn's statement had been accurate and complete, as everyone who knew her had expected. The client complaint had been reviewed and, in the estimate of the firm's external oversight body, found to have merit. No formal charges were filed, the deal had not closed, no funds had changed hands under false pretense. But the firm's internal guidelines were clear about conduct that reflected on the organization's reputation, and what had happened at the Langford Club on that Friday morning reflected poorly, in the firm's considered view, in more ways than one. Gerald Walsh called Mason with the news in the measured tone of a man delivering something he had been expecting to deliver. Administrative leave pending further review. The kind of sentence that, in a firm like theirs, usually preceded a quiet exit. Mason took the call in the apartment that now felt different in the way all rooms feel different once the person you shared them with has gone and taken the particular quality of their presence with her. He sat on the sofa and looked at the Hudson and said very little. Gerald said he was sorry. Mason said he understood. Neither of them said anything else. Abigail did not learn about the leave immediately. She was not monitoring Mason's situation. She was occupied for the first time in years with actively occupying her own. Jonathan had finalized the public registration of her role within Whitmore Holdings. The filing was quiet by the standards of financial news. A regulatory update, a holding entity shifting its disclosed ownership structure. But within the specific circles of people who paid attention to such things, it produced a recognizable shift. Elise Grant forwarded her a brief note from 2 board-adjacent contacts acknowledging the change and expressing interest in scheduling time. Margaret received 3 calls. Jonathan's office fielded 5. Abigail began attending meetings she had previously delegated. She sat in a boardroom for the first time in 4 years and reviewed a strategic briefing in person. She asked 2 questions. Both questions caused the presenter to pause and revise something he had been confident about. No one commented on this. People in that room knew who they were dealing with. She moved back into the apartment, not because she had reclaimed it from Mason, but because he had already found somewhere else to be, a short-term corporate rental on the west side, arranged through Craig Dutton's office with the efficiency of a process that neither party needed to discuss further. The apartment was still hers to keep, per the settlement. She stood in the entryway on the first evening back and looked at the glass walls and the view of the river and let the silence be what it was. She ordered food. She ate at the kitchen table. She left the laptop closed. She did not document anything that evening. There was nothing left that required documentation. In the weeks that followed, the usual mechanics of her life reassembled around her, with a different quality than before. Her mornings were her own. Her phone was no longer surveilled through the steady pressure of someone else's need for oversight. The accounts Mason had monitored so closely, the fraction of a fraction of her actual financial life, she consolidated or closed, not with drama, but simply because they were no longer necessary to maintain as they had been. Structure, she had always believed, should serve function. Some structures had outlived theirs. Richard Hale, she learned from a mutual contact, had moved his investment discussions to another firm. Daniel Brooks had not returned Mason's calls for 6 weeks. The professional world, like the personal one, adjusts to new information at its own pace. She did not follow these things with satisfaction. She followed them the way she followed most things, observationally, without investing more weight in them than they warranted. What she invested weight in was simpler. A breakfast with Margaret during which they spoke, for the first time in a long time, about things unrelated to the Whitmore structure, a book Margaret had read, a property on the coast she was considering, whether Abigail had taken a vacation in recent memory. She had not. They agreed this was something to address. They set a tentative week in February. On a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after returning to the apartment, Abigail dressed for a dinner she had been looking forward to. A Whitmore Holdings board dinner at the Langford Club, a biannual event that the club hosted for a rotating list of the organization's senior advisors, investors, and strategic partners. She had attended it twice before, years ago, before the years of quietness. She had not been in that room since the morning the coffee was thrown. Thomas Edgeworth met her in the entrance hall the way he always did. Ms. Whitmore. He said it with the warmth of someone who had been holding a door open for a long time. Thomas, she said, thank you for everything. He inclined his head. The honor is always ours. The dining room was set for 32. Candles, white tablecloths, the low, consistent hum of a room that knew how to hold important things quietly. As she entered, the conversation did not stop, but it shifted in the specific way that a room shifts when the person it is organized around has arrived. Jonathan Carter stood near the far end and raised a hand in greeting. Elise Grant was beside him. Margaret was already seated, speaking to a man Abigail recognized from the infrastructure briefing. A woman near the door introduced Abigail to the group with a brief, clear sentence. Ms. Abigail Whitmore, of Whitmore Holdings. No further qualification, no husband's name, no adjacency, just hers. Abigail took her seat at the head of the table. Thomas poured her water. The room continued its comfortable conversation. She opened her notes, reviewed the first item on the evening's agenda, and looked around at the faces of people who had known, in their various ways, exactly who she was all along. She was not performing anything. She was not demonstrating anything. She was simply present in a room that had always been hers, doing the work that had always been hers to do. No one threw anything. The dinner began. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. What would you have done in her place? And if you believe in quiet strength, you know where the subscribe button is.